Hello and welcome to Fake Awake, a space for investigating what troubles us and finding out why. I'm your host, Jess Royer, and today we're going to talk about gardening. No, not growing flowers in your 10 by 23 inches, that is, box that you have hanging precariously off your balcony railing. I mean educational gardening programs that connect children and youth to the land. I'm delighted to have you here with me as we address the complexities of urban agriculture as it manifests through educational gardening programs. Okay, so I confess that I'm kind of pushing back or responding to this idea, which came from Mitchell McLarnon, who's an assistant professor at Concordia University in Montreal. McLarnon originally presented his experience with urban agriculture and ed gardening programs during a lecture this fall. I won't go into all that he's doing, but his primary question was, why garden? Throughout the lecture, he showed us the programs he'd set up, struggled with, and started over. He explained some of the obstacles he faced, namely squirrels, and kept asking the class, why garden? The idea that getting kids gardening could be criticized was completely remote from my own line of thinking. It seems gardening programs tend to be about putting the future of the planet all on children's tiny little shoulders, and in the case of marginalized youth, seems to say, it's up to you to find ways out of poverty. Gardening can recreate colonial patterns of mastery over the land. And importantly, gardening can also evoke the very real historical racial injustice that is linked with farming. Even today, migrant workers make up a huge labor force in Canada and the United States for farming and agriculture. And another facet of gardening programs is that they're beholden to measurable outcomes, which of course falls within a neoliberal framework. Outcomes-based curricula are, and I quote, an essentialist conception of child as educational output. That's Kate Cairns' idea, as were some of the other critiques of gardening I just mentioned. She's an associate professor of childhood studies at Rutgers University. She's critical of gardening programs because she thinks that there's a lot missing from what ed gardening programs supposedly offer. Her essay, Beyond Magic Carrots, Garden Pedagogies and the Rhetoric of Effects, elaborates on her experience working with and researching two distinct youth gardens in Toronto, Ontario, and Camden, New Jersey. I highly recommend the read. That said, I'm hesitant to buy into Cairns' assumption that educational stakeholders simply overlook anything outside of the established outcomes of ed gardening programs. I refuse to believe that educators are unprepared for the pushback or difficulties participants might encounter when engaging with gardening. I prefer instead to trust in the people who have the desire to set up or manage or are already managing ed gardening programs. I don't start with the assumption that educators are irreversibly naive. I presume they're willing to get a little sweaty. With radical optimism on the brain, I decided to reach out to someone from the Urban Agricultural Project From the Root to the City, located in the Peter McGill district of Montreal. I learned about From the Root to the City through the Youth Innovation website, as I had been preparing for an interview to become a volunteer tutor of Canadian history. But before I get into the lovely meeting I had with the program coordinator, Jessica Stillwell, I'll give you a bit more information about the Peter McGill district. This is because I believe anything I say will only matter if I establish context. The Peter McGill district includes the neighborhoods Shaughnessy Village, the Golden Square Mile, Quartier des Grands Jardins, Quartier des Gares, Victor Hugo, Lucien Lallier, and some sections of Griffintown. It's located on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Currently, there are upwards of 35,000 people living in this area of Montreal, where 63% of the population are first-generation immigrants. In addition, about 48% of Peter McGill residents speak a non-official maternal language. I found all of this information on the website petermcgill.org/en, where they talk about not only the details of the district's demographic, but also the various committees, neighborhood news, and ways in which you can get involved, should you so desire. I met Jessica on a rainy, partly snowy, late November afternoon. We introduced ourselves at the Innovation Assistance Farmers Market held in the Evangel Pentecostal Church on St. Catherine Street West. The room was inviting, bustling with energy as folks made their way around the tables, examining produce and food displayed on old-fashioned wooden crates. Everything was pay what you can. A jovial glow lit the patrons' faces. Jessica suggested we venture back into the cold to peek at 2 garden sites that had recently been closed for the winter. As we walked, she spoke fondly of From the Root to the City and of her role as the program coordinator. To the relief of my cold fingers, we soon decided to go back inside where we could speak in more detail about the project and its programs. We sat in the children's library, which is located in a modern, open basement, unlike any other basement I've visited in Montreal. The floor was G-floor coin-covered and resembled a colorful foam puzzle playmat for children. I felt at ease. Jessica was confident, knowledgeable, and down-to-earth. She answered my questions without hesitation and with a refreshing frankness. While I didn't record the meeting, I'll relay what she told me from my notes. With me, I have my child, Ira de Bonville, who will interview me about that meeting.
What are some of the issues that the project addresses?
Jessica described 3 main issues that the project takes on. The first is children and youth alienation from the natural world. Humans are often described as apart from nature, but their programs aim to help children and youth feel merged with nature and the environment. Jessica said that one participant in the program recently said that as much as she was taking care of the plants were taking care of her. Also, for many of these kids, connecting with the environment through urban agriculture is the first time they've ever cared for something other than themselves. The second issue is that the Peter McGill district faces socioeconomic disparity, and there's a positive sense of ownership and pride that develops when working in these gardens. A related issue is that there is a serious lack of green space in the district, which makes it difficult for residents to garden even if they wanted to. And that's where From the Root to the City comes in. They collaborate with public and private landowners to secure spaces where people can get their hands dirty. And finally, the third issue is alienation from the community. This is a more complicated issue that affects all ages. As I mentioned before, the majority of the residents are first-generation immigrants. It's possible that these folks don't know anyone, let alone where or what to garden. It's also possible that the children of these folks are alienated from their parents because they aren't able to communicate using their parents' mother tongue, or can't relate culturally to each other or society at large. From the Root to the City is focused on strengthening community and intergenerational bonds. They do this with their programs aimed at children and youth, but also by encouraging elderly folks to get involved as well.
How do they know that everything is working?
Right, so here I was asking about those measurable outcomes that ed gardening programs are bound to. There is a program within From the Root to the City that's an internship program for youth 14 to 22 years old, interested in agriculture or in working with the community. For the funders, this program is it. Because it's aimed at youth employment, it has all the typical outcomes of an ed gardening project that have to be measured. Funders want to know the demographic information, the number of participants, etc. For the intern program and the other programs, there are self-evaluations, exit interviews, one-on-one interviews, and online surveys to gather information from the participants and volunteers. But Jessica was more interested in the ideological successes of the programs, which are when plants grow and when people grow. She explained that the peripheral benefits, her antonym of the term collateral damage, tend to be on the people side of things. So just because there are these measurable outcomes doesn't mean that the rest is going unnoticed or unacknowledged.
What makes this project a Montreal project?
The history of agriculture in Montreal is a long one. Jessica shared some research she had done in 2016 on European-style agriculture on the island that dated back to the 1600s. And of course, agriculture was going on long before colonialism installed the European way of life. But as the Europeans took over, their methods introduced a sickness to the land, as typically the health of the soil was overlooked. Now, From the Root to the City is very careful to consider and implement gardening practices that don't repeat the mistakes of the past. With that in mind, the project partners with Indigenous knowledge keepers and organizations such as the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal and the Indigenous Health Center of Jojage. I'm quoting Jessica now. "There is life in the land, but it has been severed from its original stewards." Another aspect of what makes this project a Montreal project is that it responds directly to and for the people living in the Peter McGill district. They hold community consultation events and make decisions based on what's working and what's not working because their goal is to reflect the diversity of the neighborhood. In terms of geography, Mount Royal is actually considered a part of the Peter McGill district. This means that if we do a calculation of green space per 1,000 residents, we're going to get a number that doesn't truly reflect how accessible the green spaces actually are. Jessica gave me the example of a parent pushing a stroller to seek a little green therapy by walking up the mountain, as we residents of Montreal call Mount Royal Park. Well, I checked Google Maps, and from the headquarters of From the Route to This City, that's a 38-minute, 2.5-kilometer walk with a 135-meter incline just to get to the park. By increasing the number of green spaces in the Peter McGill district, From the Route to the City makes getting connected with the land more accessible.
What problems has the project faced over the years?
There are so many problems that any agricultural or urban agricultural project will face. Jessica talked to me about squirrels and soil contaminants being issues. There's a difficulty in tracking how many people use the garden because they have this open harvest policy, with certain limits of course, but this means that anyone can come and pick basil from the garden, for example. The neighborhoods also see a lot of turnover, so it's difficult to keep people interested if they've moved, obviously. Because of the low socioeconomic status of many residents, people are often working full-time. Sometimes they have several jobs, and they're just too tired to volunteer in the gardens. Another issue is Mother Nature. I already mentioned the squirrels, but there's also climate change to contend with. Jessica told me that the weather has become erratic, unpredictable, whereas in previous years they could say with some degree of certainty when the first and last frosts would be, now they simply don't know. This is one of the reasons why they care so much about the health of the soil and in growing indigenous plants, and why they have, for the time being, sworn off of tomatoes. This issue ties into another problem, funding. Jessica had this to say: people want to fund short-term, sexy projects. Yeah, urban ag, as it's called by the cool kids, is not so sexy. Taken together with all the problems I've already listed, urban agriculture projects are long. Jessica said that it takes 3 years for a garden to be, well, a garden. The first year is spent setting it up, encountering problems, and troubleshooting. In the second year, you have to compare the gardens to the previous year and troubleshoot some more. And the third year is when you can have a more solid plan and hopefully a better harvest. This longer outlook doesn't jibe with the neoliberal push for short-term gain, and that's wonderful.
What is the future of the project?
I've already spoken about the desire to form relationships with Indigenous folks, but the project is a long way from what might be called Indigenous focused or led. They've had difficulty recruiting Indigenous youth to participate in the programs, and I know that this is something they want to work on and feel is their responsibility to make happen. Another future move is to eventually reach a point where there are intentional community feedback outlets that take other forms besides having to hold meetings in a park. Again, this is about accessibility and making sure they are serving the needs of the community. And finally, From the Route to the City will continue to weigh the effects of green gentrification. I asked Jessica about this because unfortunately, as neighborhoods establish more green space, property values rise, and generally wealthier people move in, thereby displacing the residents who sometimes were the very ones who helped set up and maintain those green spaces. I'm going to quote Jessica exactly here because I think she does an excellent job. The short answer is yes. Peter McGill is already a neighborhood with a real affordability problem, so we think about gentrification in general a lot. The longer answer is that we do what we can to mitigate for that concern. One of the benefits of From the Route to the City being part of the larger innovation youth ecosystem is that we get to pair our work of making green space welcoming and accessible to the community with our work of advocacy for affordable housing and our work on the cohabitation portfolio in the neighborhood. We believe that relationships with the natural world should not be reliant on income level, and we work hard to step in the way of green gentrification in the ways that we can. We're not always successful, but we're intentional in our planning, at the very least.
Where can listeners find out more?
Listeners can check out the Innovation Youth website, which is both in French and English. Just go to the bottom and choose the language that is easier for you. The URL is innovationjeune.com. Then on the top menu bar, hover over services and you'll see urban agriculture from the root to the city. Click on that and you'll be brought to the main page that describes the project, its missions, and all of its programs. That is the internship project that I already described, the Summer Garden Club program for kids 6 to 11, and the community education program. At the bottom of the page, you can find out how to volunteer or get involved and who to contact. And of course, there's an Instagram page that you can follow. The handle is at de la racine à la ville, which is the French version of From the Root to the City. I'll also include 2 news pieces that feature the project on our website, fakeawakepodcast.com, where you can also find a list of sources for this episode.
Any final comments?
2 things. 1. From the Root to the City encompasses several programs with 3 missions: that of protecting the soil, empowering youth, and representing the community at large. I think some people might look at From the Root to the City and think, wow, you folks are trying to do too much. But if we're thinking in systems, which we should be doing, they're all related. Everything we do is for a reason and exists within a system. Our behavior matters. Where we put our attention matters. This leads me to the final comment. Ed gardening programs may use the rhetoric of effect, as in, what are the effects of these programs? How do they benefit people? But I think that's okay, as long as we acknowledge that things might happen that were unexpected or even undesirable, as Cairns argues. Although I'm not convinced that humans can operate from a place where they adhere strictly to the measurable outcomes of any curriculum. For example, when I have my students participate in an information gap exercise in my ESL classes, I might write that my measurable outcome is that students will practice question formation using real-world examples of text to communicate in English. We all know the benefits far exceed the outcomes I wrote in my lesson plan. Perhaps it's best if we don't try to bottle up or measure human relationships that form peripheral benefits. And this reminds me of Marilyn Waring's TED Talk about unpaid labor and the GDP. She argues that though we must acknowledge unpaid labor and in turn reformulate what is of value in our societies, the answer is not to add unpaid labor into the framework of the GDP. Instead, we need a new framework. And similarly, I believe there's profound value in recognizing the peripheral benefits and hardships that appear off-script from ed gardening programs. But I don't advocate for adopting them into the official curriculum. Rather, we can follow Simon Springer's advice on how to, quote, actively dismantle neoliberalism, and that's by doing things outside of its reach. And to stop giving it power. So to come back to McLarnin's question, why garden? Well, because it's an unsexy, tedious, long-term undertaking that can build and rebuild relationships and communities, which ultimately works to undo the arresting hold neoliberalism has over us. And if you happen to get a few skills that increase your chances of getting a job, splendid. I'll end with a quote from the book entitled Happiness, Hope, and Despair: Rethinking the Role of Education by Peter Roberts. We cannot always escape from despair, but sometimes must continue to grapple with it and, in a sense, live through it. While it is true that despair can be understood as a state of being or a situation without hope, it is also possible to see despair as the very condition that gives hope substance and meaning. Hope, as it were, comes into its own when despair is identified, understood, and addressed. It is when circumstances are most desperate that hope is needed more than ever. Despair need not provide a reason for inaction or indifference. To the contrary, it can serve as the basis on which a passionate commitment to life may proceed. Thank you, Mitchell, for the idea and for challenging me. Thank you, Jessica, for your time and generosity and all that you do. Thank you, Ira, for doing such a fabulous job on your debut as an interviewer. Thank you, Mike, for being there no matter what. And of course, thank you for listening. Peace and long life, everyone.